poor black widow falls asleep on a cowboy's shoulder. What he did next will shock you. "Move along, you don't belong here," sneers the stagecoach passenger as the trembling woman clutches her last $3. Everyone assumes the widow will die forgotten in some dusty frontier town, another casualty of poverty and prejudice. But when exhaustion finally claims her, and she collapses against the silent giant cowboy beside her, something shifts in his weathered face. This mysterious ranch hand carries secrets that could either destroy her completely or transform her into one of the territory's most powerful landowners. Yet, he's been lying about who he really is, and his deception runs deeper than anyone imagines. When the truth emerges, will it save her life or seal her doom? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The dusty stagecoach station in Amarillo buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers and traders. Evelyn Carter clutched her worn carpetbag against her chest, feeling the weight of her last $3 through the fabric. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as she approached the ticket window. "One fare to Copper Ridge, please," she said quietly. The clerk barely glanced up. "That'll be $2.50. Evelyn handed over the coins, leaving her with barely enough for a single meal. Around her, other passengers loaded their belongings with the help of porters and family members. She stood alone. A well-dressed woman in a feathered hat wrinkled her nose as Evelyn walked past. "I do hope we won't be crowded," the woman whispered loudly to her companion. "Some people simply don't know their place." Evelyn kept her eyes down and found a spot near the back of the waiting area. Her black dress, though carefully mended, showed the wear of too many washings. The letter from the law office crinkled in her bag, reminding her of matters she couldn't afford to pursue. Her husband's death in the mine collapse had left her with nothing but debts and this desperate journey to care for her dying sister Martha. The stagecoach driver called for boarding. Passengers pushed forward eagerly, but Evelyn waited until the crowd thinned. As she approached the coach, a large man stepped aside and tipped his hat to her. "Ma'am," he said simply. Thomas Mallory stood nearly a head taller than most men, with shoulders that filled his worn leather vest. His brown hair needed cutting, and his boots showed the scuffs of hard work. Unlike the other passengers, he didn't stare at her with curiosity or disdain. He simply helped her up into the coach with the same courtesy he'd shown the elderly preacher ahead of her. The interior of the stagecoach cramped 6 passengers into space, meant for 4. Evelyn found herself pressed against the window, grateful for the small mercy of fresh air. Thomas settled across from her, his presence somehow reassuring in the confined space. "First time." "To Copper Ridge?" asked a merchant with gold teeth. "Yes, sir," Evelyn replied. "What brings you out that way?" The question carried the weight of judgment. "Family business," she answered, hoping to end the conversation. Thomas caught her eye briefly and gave an almost imperceptible nod. Something about his quiet manner suggested he understood the burden of unwanted questions. The coach lurched into motion, wheels grinding against the dirt road. Miles stretched ahead through increasingly rough terrain. Evelyn tried to ignore the gnawing hunger in her stomach as the other passengers shared food from their baskets. When they stopped at the first way station, Thomas appeared at her elbow as she stepped down. "Biscuit?" He held out a cloth bundle. "I couldn't," she began. "Made too many this morning. Hate to see them go to waste." His tone made it clear this was practical, not charity. Evelyn accepted gratefully, too hungry to maintain pride over an empty stomach. At the station, Sheriff Wilkes stood near the water trough, his badge catching the sunlight. His eyes followed Evelyn's movements with the calculating stare of a man who believed certain people needed watching. "You folks be careful on the road ahead," he called out. "Sometimes trouble finds those who go looking for it." The warning seemed directed specifically at her. Thomas stepped closer, not quite between them, but near enough to make his position clear. Back on the coach, the afternoon heat became stifling. Evelyn's head began to nod as exhaustion from months of working 3 jobs caught up with her. The rhythmic bouncing of the wheels grew hypnotic. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Dark clouds gathered overhead, promising one of those sudden storms that could turn prairie roads into rivers of mud. The first fat raindrops splattered against the coach windows. Within minutes, the gentle patter became a driving downpour. The coach swayed dangerously as wheels struggled for purchase on the increasingly slick road. "Hold on!" shouted the driver. A violent lurch threw passengers against each other. Evelyn, already drowsy from exhaustion and the day's heat, found herself thrown sideways. Her shoulder landed against Thomas's solid frame. Too tired to fight anymore, she remained there as sleep finally claimed her. "Papa's papers," she murmured in her sleep, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Hidden in the Bible. What the lawyer man said about the land." Thomas glanced down at the sleeping woman against his shoulder. Her carpetbag had fallen open, revealing the edge of an official-looking letter. He could make out the letterhead of a law firm, but turned his attention away from what wasn't his business. The feathered hat woman stared with obvious disapproval. "Well, I never," she muttered. Thomas's steady gaze met hers until she looked away. A tremendous crack split the air. The coach tilted sharply to one side and ground to a halt. Through the rain-streaked windows, they could see the right rear wheel had snapped clean through. "Everyone out!" called the driver. "Need all hands to get this fixed." As passengers began to stir and complain, Evelyn woke to find herself still leaning against the mysterious cowboy's shoulder. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized where she'd been sleeping. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling away quickly. "No harm done," Thomas replied quietly. But something in his expression had changed. The innocent words she'd spoken in her sleep had planted questions that would soon uproot everything she thought she knew about her life. The storm raged around them, and 20 miles still stretched to Copper Ridge, where secrets waited that would transform a poor widow into something far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The broken stagecoach wheel took 3 hours to repair. Thomas organized the effort with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to solving problems. He positioned the jack, directed the lifting, and had them back on the muddy road before sunset. Evelyn watched him work with growing curiosity. Ranch foremen didn't usually take charge of situations involving strangers. Something about his movements suggested training that went beyond cattle and horses. They reached Copper Ridge as darkness fell. The town's main street stretched between rows of weathered buildings, their windows glowing with lamplight. Thomas walked beside Evelyn as she made her way to Martha's boarding house, carrying her bag without being asked. "Thank you for everything," she said at the front door. "Hope your family business goes well," he replied, tipping his hat. Inside, Martha lay propped against pillows, her face gaunt with illness. At 62, she looked decades older than when Evelyn had seen her last. "Sister," Martha whispered, gripping Evelyn's hand with surprising strength, "I've been waiting. There's something you need to know. Rest first. We can talk tomorrow." "No time for waiting." Martha's eyes held urgent intensity. "It's about Papa. About what he earned in the war." Evelyn settled into the chair beside the bed. Their father had died when she was 15, taking his stories of army service with him. She'd always assumed he'd been a cook or laborer, like most colored men who served. Martha reached under her pillow and withdrew a leather portfolio, cracked with age. "He wasn't just any soldier, Evelyn. He was a scout. Rode with cavalry units deep into Confederate territory." The portfolio contained documents Evelyn had never seen. Commendations signed by Union officers, maps in her father's careful handwriting, letters of recommendation that spoke of courage and invaluable service. "The government paid him," Martha continued, "not in money, in land." Evelyn's breath caught. What land? 640 acres, prime grazing territory with year-round water. He filed the claim properly, but died before he could work it. Martha's fingers trembled as she pointed to an official document. "It's yours now. Has been all along." The land grant bore official seals and signatures. Evelyn's father had been awarded one full section of territory in recognition of his military service. The legal description matched property she'd passed on the way into town, rolling hills dotted with cattle and crossed by a clear-running creek. Why didn't you tell me before? Wasn't safe. Still isn't, but I'm dying and you need to know. Martha coughed, specks of blood on her handkerchief. That letter from the lawyers. They've been trying to reach you about the probate. Evelyn pulled the crumpled letter from her bag. The legal language made more sense now. The firm had been attempting to process her inheritance for months, but couldn't afford their fees to complete the proceedings. There's more. Martha's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Someone else knows about the land. Someone who doesn't want you to claim it. A knock at the boarding house door interrupted them. Evelyn heard the landlady's voice, then heavier footsteps on the stairs. Sheriff Wilkes appeared in the doorway, hat in hand and smile too wide. Heard we had a new arrival in town, he said, eyes scanning the room. Just wanted to make sure everything's in order. Everything's fine, thank you, Evelyn replied carefully. His gaze lingered on the documents spread across Martha's bed. Legal matters can be mighty complicated for folks who aren't familiar with such things. Happy to help sort through any confusion. That's very kind, but we're managing. Wilkes stepped closer, and Evelyn instinctively gathered the papers. Course, some situations require official oversight. Wouldn't want anyone taking advantage of a grieving family. The threat wrapped itself in concern, but Evelyn heard it clearly. She folded the documents and held them against her chest. We appreciate your offer, Sheriff. If we need assistance, we'll certainly ask. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You do that. Good evening, ladies. His boots echoed down the stairs, but Evelyn noticed he paused at the front door, speaking quietly with the landlady before leaving. He knows, Martha whispered once they were alone, or suspects. How is that possible? Land records are public. Someone's been watching for your name to appear. Martha gripped Evelyn's wrist. There's a man here in town, Clayton Morse. Owns the biggest ranch in 3 counties, but he needs water rights to expand. Your property controls the only year-round stream for 50 miles. The pieces fell into place with terrifying clarity. The sheriff's sudden interest, the aggressive helpfulness, the way people had stared at her since arriving in town. What do I do? Learn the business fast. Find people you can trust. Martha's breathing grew labored. And be careful who you trust. Money makes men do terrible things. The next morning brought news that spread through town, like wildfire. The poor widow from the stagecoach owned prime ranch land worth thousands of dollars. Suddenly, Evelyn found herself the center of attention she'd never wanted. Thomas appeared at the boarding house after breakfast, his expression unreadable. Heard you might need some help understanding the cattle business, he said simply. What makes you think I own cattle? Word travels fast in small towns. Also saw Clayton Morse heading this way with papers in his hand and determination in his step. Through the window, Evelyn spotted a well-dressed man striding up the street, flanked by 2 riders. Even at a distance, his purpose looked unmistakable. Why would you help me? She asked Thomas. Everyone deserves a fair chance to succeed or fail on their own merits. Something in his tone suggested personal experience with unfair treatment. Before she could ask more questions, heavy boots stomped onto the boarding house porch. Clayton Morse knocked with the confidence of a man who expected doors to open quickly. Clayton Morse filled the boarding house doorway like a man accustomed to owning whatever space he entered. His silver-trimmed vest and polished boots spoke of wealth, but his eyes held the calculating coldness of someone who took what he wanted. Miss Carter, I presume, he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Clayton Morse. I believe we have business to discuss. Evelyn remained seated beside Martha's bed, the land documents safely tucked away. I wasn't aware we had any business, Mr. Morse. Oh, but we do. Quite lucrative business, in fact. He stepped uninvited into the room, his 2 riders remaining on the porch. I understand you've inherited some property. Raw land can be a terrible burden for someone without ranching experience. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Morse's smile never wavered, but something predatory flickered in his expression. Of course not. These decisions take time. Fortunately, I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. $500, cash money, for the entire section. The amount represented more money than Evelyn had seen in her lifetime, but Thomas's presence in the doorway caught her attention. His slight shake of the head told her everything. That's very kind, Mr. Morse, but I need time to consider my options. Time can be expensive in the cattle business. Weather, disease, market fluctuations. So many things can go wrong. His tone remained pleasant, but the underlying message was clear. My offer might not remain available indefinitely. After Morse left, Thomas helped Evelyn understand exactly what she'd inherited. They rode out to the property on borrowed horses, and what she saw took her breath away. Rolling grassland stretched to the horizon, dotted with oak trees and crossed by Silver Creek. Hundreds of cattle bearing her father's registered brand grazed peacefully. A sturdy cabin sat on a hill overlooking the water, its stone chimney and solid construction suggesting permanence. Your father knew what he was doing when he claimed this land, Thomas said. Best grazing in the territory, and that creek never runs dry. Evelyn dismounted and walked to the water's edge. The clear stream bubbled over smooth stones, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Fish darted in the deeper pools. This wasn't just land. This was wealth that could support generations. How much is it really worth? Conservative estimate? $10,000. Maybe more if cattle prices rise. The number staggered her. Morse's offer of $500 suddenly looked like the insult it was meant to be. Over the following days, Thomas taught her the fundamentals of ranching. How to read the health of grass and cattle, where to find water in dry seasons, which buyers paid fair prices, and which ones cheated newcomers. Evelyn discovered she had an aptitude for the business that surprised them both. Her late husband had taught her to read contracts and legal documents during his mining days. The skills translated perfectly to cattle sales and land management. She also began teaching at the small schoolhouse, bringing together Mexican, white, and the few colored children in the area. The integrated classroom raised eyebrows, but parents appreciated having their children learn to read and cipher properly. Most folks around here can't do sums past their fingers, Thomas observed, watching her work with a group of students. You're giving those kids something valuable. Education was how my parents escaped slavery, seemed worth passing on. But not everyone approved of Evelyn's growing influence. Strange incidents began plaguing her property. Fences cut during the night, allowing cattle to wander onto neighbors' land. Gates left open that should have been secured. Threatening notes appeared nailed to her cabin door. Thomas began staying closer to the ranch, claiming he needed to check on the cattle more frequently. His presence during several nighttime disturbances prevented more serious damage. But Evelyn noticed he always seemed to know where trouble might occur. How do you always happen to be in the right place? She asked after he stopped rustlers from running off a dozen head of cattle. Experience. Learn to read the signs when men are planning mischief. His answer felt incomplete, but before she could press further, Sheriff Wilkes arrived with questions about the rustling attempt. Mighty convenient how Mr. Mallory keeps showing up when there's trouble, Wilkes observed, almost like he knows when to expect it. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke from a green fire. Thomas met the sheriff's stare without flinching, but Evelyn caught something uncomfortable in his expression. That evening, she found Thomas checking the horses in the barn. Sheriff Wilkes seemed to think you know more about these incidents than you're saying. Wilkes thinks a lot of things, most of them wrong. That's not an answer. Thomas straightened slowly, hay still in his hands. I spent 5 years as a Texas Ranger before I came here. Learned to spot trouble before it happens, some skills you don't lose. The revelation explained his tactical thinking and leadership abilities, but raised new questions. Why would a former lawman work as a simple ranch hand? What had brought him to this particular area at this particular time? Why didn't you tell me before? Past doesn't always improve present circumstances. Figured what mattered was whether I could help you succeed. Before Evelyn could respond, hoofbeats thundered into the ranch yard. A dozen riders surrounded the cabin, their intentions clear even in the fading light. Clayton Morse sat his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. "Miss Carter, I believe it's time we had another conversation about that sale." The riders spread out with military precision, cutting off potential escape routes. Thomas stepped closer to Evelyn, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "I told you I needed time to consider," Evelyn called out. "Time's up. My associates here represent various business interests that require immediate resolution of this property matter. The threat couldn't have been clearer if he'd drawn a weapon, but something in Thomas's posture suggested this confrontation had been building toward more than anyone realized. "Might want to reconsider this approach, Morse," Thomas said quietly. "And why would I listen to hired help?" Thomas's smile held no warmth whatsoever. "Because some hired help comes with connections you haven't considered." The tension stretched tight as fence wire in a windstorm, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. The standoff in the ranch yard stretched like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Morse's riders shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands hovering near their weapons. Thomas stood perfectly still, but Evelyn could feel the coiled tension in his frame. "Last chance, Miss Carter," Morse called out. "Sign the papers, take the money, and avoid unpleasantness." "I said no." Morse nodded to his men. They began dismounting with deliberate slowness, making their intentions clear without crossing into outright violence. Yet. "You know what I find interesting, Morse?" Thomas's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Your men are positioned exactly like cavalry preparing to take a fortified position. Military training shows." Something flickered in Morse's expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or concern. "Most ranch hands wouldn't notice tactical formations," Thomas continued conversationally. "Of course, most ranch hands didn't spend years tracking wanted men across 3 territories. The words hit Morse like physical blows. His confident posture wavered slightly. "I believe you gentlemen should move along," Thomas said, "before the situation becomes more complicated than anyone wants." Morse stared hard at Thomas for a long moment, then jerked his reins. "This isn't over, Miss Carter. Land disputes have a way of resolving themselves." The riders withdrew, but their departure felt more like a strategic retreat than a surrender. "What just happened?" Evelyn asked once they were alone. Thomas was quiet for a long time. "Morse recognized me. Probably didn't expect to find a former ranger standing between him and easy money. There's more to it than that. Usually is." His evasive answer frustrated her, but before she could press further, urgent knocking echoed from the cabin door. Martha's landlady stood on the porch, wringing her hands. "Miss Carter, you need to come quick. Your sister's asking for you, and she's not doing well." They rode hard back to town. Martha lay gasping in her narrow bed, her skin pale as winter sky. She gripped Evelyn's hand with desperate strength. "Listen carefully," Martha whispered. "There are things about your friend you need to know." "Thomas? What about him?" "Asked around town after he started helping you. Nobody knows much about where he came from or why he's here." Martha's breathing grew labored. "But Mrs. Henderson at the general store said something strange. Man matching his description was asking questions about our family months ago, before you even arrived." The words sent ice through Evelyn's veins. "That's impossible." Henderson remembered because he paid for information with new silver dollars. Wanted to know about Papa's war service and whether any family survived. Evelyn's mind raced. Thomas had claimed to be surprised by her inheritance. But if he'd been investigating her family before they met, everything about their relationship was built on lies. Why would he do that? Martha's grip tightened. Only 2 reasons a man researches land ownership in advance. Either he wants to buy it, or someone's paying him to find out about it. The implications crashed over Evelyn like a flash flood. Had Thomas been working for Morse all along? Was his protection and friendship just an elaborate deception to gain her trust? Martha died 3 hours later, her final words a warning to trust no one completely. The funeral drew most of the town. Thomas stood beside Evelyn at the graveside, offering quiet support that now felt tainted with suspicion. Every kind gesture from the past weeks took on new meaning. Had he orchestrated their meeting on the stagecoach? Arranged to be there when she needed help? After the service, Evelyn confronted him directly. "Mrs. Henderson says a man matching your description was asking about my family months ago, before we met." Thomas went very still. "Mrs. Henderson talks a lot, not always accurately. So you deny it?" "I deny nothing. But I'd like to know why you're asking." His non-answer confirmed her worst fears. "Who are you really, and what do you want with my land?" "It's complicated." "Then uncomplicated." Thomas removed his hat and ran fingers through his hair. The gesture seemed to age him 10 years. "I came to Copper Ridge because of your property. That much is true." Betrayal cut through her like a blade. Everything she'd begun to feel for him crumbled into dust and lies. "You work for Morse." "No, I work for someone else entirely." "Who?" "My father." The answer made no sense. "Your father is a rancher who needs help investigating land claims?" "My father is Clayton Morse." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She stepped backward, nearly stumbling over Martha's fresh grave. "You're his son." His son who hasn't spoken to him in 15 years. His son who was supposed to befriend you, court you, and convince you to sell the land cheaply. Thomas's voice held bitter self-recrimination. His son who was supposed to marry you and gain control of the water rights that way. Evelyn felt sick. Every moment between them had been calculated manipulation. Every kindness a step in an elaborate plan to steal her inheritance. "How long have you been planning this?" "The plan started months ago, but the plan changed the moment I met you on that stagecoach." "Changed how?" "I fell in love with you. Real love, not the pretense I was supposed to manufacture." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes desperate. "Everything I felt, everything between us, that was genuine." "How could I possibly believe that now?" "Because I've been sabotaging my father's efforts for weeks. Those cut fences, the rustling attempts, the threatening notes. I was warning you ahead of time, protecting your cattle, making sure his intimidation failed." The pieces fit together with horrible clarity. Thomas's uncanny ability to prevent damage, his knowledge of when trouble might occur, his inside information about tactics and timing. "You've been playing both sides. I chose your side the day you fell asleep on my shoulder. Everything since then has been me trying to find a way to protect you from my own family." Evelyn stared at him, searching for truth in a face she no longer recognized. The man who had taught her ranching, protected her property, and earned her trust was the son of her greatest enemy. "Does he know you've been working against him?" "Not yet. But after today's confrontation, he's going to figure it out pretty quickly." "What happens then?" Thomas met her eyes with grim certainty. "Then this stops being about business and becomes about family betrayal. And my father doesn't forgive that kind of disloyalty." The confrontation came at dawn 3 days later. Clayton Morse arrived at Evelyn's ranch with Sheriff Wilkes and a leather satchel full of official-looking documents. This time, he brought no riders. He didn't need them. "Miss Carter," Morse announced from his saddle, "I'm afraid there's been a significant development regarding your land claim." Evelyn stepped onto her porch, Thomas beside her. The tension between father and son crackled like lightning before a storm. "What kind of development?" Morse dismounted and spread papers across her porch rail. "Turns out your father's military service records contain some discrepancies. The land grant appears to have been issued in error." Evelyn examined the documents. They looked official, complete with government seals and signatures, but something about the paper seemed too new, the ink too fresh. "These are forgeries," she said flatly. "That's a serious accusation," Sheriff Wilkes interjected. "Mr. Morse obtained these directly from the Territorial Land Office. Then someone at the Land Office is being paid to manufacture false documents." Morse's smile held no warmth. "Careful, Miss Carter. Accusations like that could be considered slander." Thomas stepped forward, studying the papers with practiced eyes. "The signature's wrong. Colonel Morrison signed all land grants with his full name and rank. This just says Morrison. And how would you know that, boy? Morse's voice turned cold as Winter Creek water. Because I've seen enough authentic military documents to recognize forgeries. The standoff stretched taut between father and son. Years of history and betrayal hung in the air like gun smoke. You always were too clever for your own good, Morse said quietly. Should have stayed away from matters that don't concern you. This concerns me plenty. Does it? Or are you just trying to get your hands on property that's worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes? The accusation hit its target. Evelyn felt doubt creep through her certainty about Thomas's motives. How could she trust a man who'd admitted to months of deception? That's not what this is about, Thomas replied. No? Then what is it about? Your sudden attack of conscience? Your noble desire to protect the helpless? Morse's voice dripped contempt. Or maybe you figured out she's worth more as an ally than an enemy. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching riders echoed across the ranch. But these weren't Morse's men. A small group approached under a white flag of truce, led by an elderly woman Evelyn recognized from the stagecoach. Mabel Johnson dismounted with surprising agility for her age. Behind her rode a man wearing a federal marshal's badge. Miss Carter, Mabel said warmly, I believe we need to have a conversation. Morse's confident expression wavered slightly. Mrs. Johnson, I wasn't aware you had business in these parts. Oh, but I do. Very important business regarding military land grants and the families of Union Army scouts. She opened a worn leather portfolio and withdrew documents that made Morse's forgeries look like children's drawings. You see, Miss Carter, your father saved my husband's life during the war. Captain Johnson commanded the cavalry unit your father scouted for. When William died last year, I made it my mission to find the families of the men who served with him. The marshal stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm Marshal Stevens. Mrs. Johnson contacted my office about irregularities in territorial land records. We've been investigating fraudulent claims for several months. Evelyn's heart raced. What kind of irregularities? Someone's been filing false documents to challenge legitimate military land grants, usually targeting properties with valuable water rights. Stevens fixed his gaze on Morse. Always seemed to benefit the same local businessman. Morse's face had gone pale, but he maintained his composure. I'm sure any irregularities were simple clerical errors. Clerical errors don't involve bribing territorial clerks to backdate false documents, Stevens replied. We have sworn testimony about payments made for fraudulent paperwork. The marshal's words hit like hammer blows. Morse's entire scheme was unraveling in broad daylight. Furthermore, Mabel continued, producing another document, I have the original land grant signed by Colonel Morrison himself. William kept copies of all his unit's commendations. Your father earned this land through genuine service and sacrifice. Evelyn examined the authentic document. Every detail matched her father's version, down to the colonel's distinctive full signature. Thomas spoke quietly to his father. It's over. The forgeries, the intimidation, all of it. Walk away now, and maybe you can avoid federal prosecution. Morse's mask of civility finally slipped. You ungrateful fool. Everything I built, everything I worked for, you're throwing away for a woman who'll never see you as anything but the enemy's son. Maybe she's right to see it that way. The admission cut through Evelyn's anger like a knife through silk. Thomas wasn't defending himself or making excuses. He was accepting responsibility for his deception while still choosing to do the right thing. Marshal Stevens stepped between the two men. Mr. Morse, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and bribery of territorial officials. You can't prove anything. Actually, we can. Your inside man at the land office has been cooperating with our investigation for weeks. Turns out he kept detailed records of every fraudulent document he was paid to create. As Stevens placed Morse in restraints, the fallen cattle baron's eyes found Thomas one last time. You chose her over your own blood, over everything I built for you. I chose what was right over what was profitable. Maybe that's the difference between us. Sheriff Wilkes tried to slip away during the arrest, but Stevens called him back. Sheriff, we'll need to discuss your role in these irregularities as well. The corrupt lawman's shoulders sagged in defeat. As the prisoners were led away, Evelyn found herself alone with Thomas and the weight of everything that had happened between them. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now you decide whether you can forgive me for the lies I told while trying to protect you from the truth." The question hung between them like morning mist over Silver Creek, waiting for the sun to burn it away or the wind to make it permanent. The trials of Clayton Morse and Sheriff Wilkes became the biggest news in 3 counties. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of a conspiracy that had defrauded dozens of legitimate landowners over 5 years. Morse received 10 years in federal prison. Wilkes got 7. Thomas testified against his own father, providing crucial details about the intimidation tactics and forged documents. His testimony sealed the convictions, but the cost showed in his weathered face and sleepless nights. Evelyn attended every day of the trial, watching the man who had protected her destroy his own family to ensure justice prevailed. The contradiction of his character, deceiver and protector, enemy's son and loyal ally, left her struggling to reconcile her feelings. After the verdicts, Thomas approached her outside the courthouse. "I'll be leaving Copper Ridge," he said quietly. "Figure it's best for everyone. Where will you go?" "Doesn't matter much. Just away from here." Evelyn studied his face, seeing genuine pain beneath the stoic exterior. "Running away seems like the coward's choice." "Maybe it is, but staying would be selfish." "Selfish how?" "Because I love you, and that complicates everything." He met her eyes directly. "You deserve better than the son of the man who tried to steal your inheritance." She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Trust, once broken, required time and proof to rebuild. "Maybe you're right," she said finally. "Maybe time apart would be best." Thomas nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. "Take care of yourself, Evelyn. You're stronger than you know." He walked away without looking back. 1 year later, Evelyn's ranch had become the most successful operation in the territory. Her integrated school educated 60 children from 5 different communities. The creek-fed pastures supported twice as many cattle as before, and her breeding program produced animals that sold at premium prices. Mabel Johnson had moved to Copper Ridge permanently, becoming the grandmother figure Evelyn had never known. She helped manage the school and provided wisdom about everything from cattle diseases to community politics. "You've built something remarkable here," Mabel observed one evening as they watched children play in the ranch yard after school. "It feels incomplete," Evelyn admitted. "Because of Thomas?" The direct question didn't surprise her. Mabel had a gift for cutting straight to the heart of matters. "I think about him every day. Wonder where he went, what he's doing, whether he's safe. Love doesn't disappear because circumstances get complicated. How do you trust someone who spent months lying to you?" Mabel considered the question while watching fireflies begin their evening dance. "Same way you trust anyone else. You judge them by their actions when it mattered most. When the choice was between easy profit and doing right, what did Thomas choose?" The answer was obvious, but Evelyn had been too hurt to see it clearly. "He chose to protect me, even when it cost him his family. That tells you everything you need to know about his character." The next morning brought unexpected visitors. A family of Mexican ranchers arrived with urgent news about cattle rustlers operating along the territorial border. They needed help organizing a cooperative defense. "Senora Carter," the eldest said, "we have heard of your success here, your methods of fair dealing and honest partnership. We would be honored to work together." As they discussed strategy, one of the younger men mentioned an interesting detail. "There is a man, a former ranger, who has been helping small ranchers fight off organized thieves. He asks for no payment, only meals and a place to sleep." Evelyn's heart quickened. "What does this man look like?" "Tall, broad shoulders, very quiet. He has the bearing of someone who has seen much trouble but remains honorable." The description matched Thomas perfectly. He is called Bear by those he helps, like the animal, strong but gentle and less threatened. Evelyn made her decision. saddle my horse, and pack supplies for a week's travel. Senora, it is dangerous country. Then I'll need guides who know the way. 3 days of hard riding brought them to a small ranch where smoke rose from recent destruction. Burned barns and scattered cattle told the story of another rustler attack. But the main house stood intact, and people moved purposefully through the yard. Thomas stood near the corral, helping rebuild damaged fencing. His back was to them, but Evelyn would have recognized his frame anywhere. He turned at the sound of approaching horses. His expression cycled through surprise, joy, and careful neutrality. "Evelyn, what are you doing here?" She dismounted and walked directly to him. "Coming to find my business partner." "Your what?" "I'm expanding operations. Need someone who knows cattle, understands land management, and can be trusted to do the right thing when nobody's watching." Thomas glanced at the Mexican ranchers who had accompanied her. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because people will talk. The son of Clayton Morse working with the woman he tried to cheat. Let them talk. I know who you really are." She stepped closer, close enough to see the hope he was trying to hide. "I know you chose justice over family, chose protecting me over easy money, chose exile over staying where your presence might cause me trouble." She reached up and touched his face. "That's the man I fell in love with. Not Clayton Morse's son. You." Thomas covered her hand with his own. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more certain of anything." Their kiss tasted of dust and hope and second chances earned through sacrifice. 6 months later, they married under the cottonwoods beside Silver Creek. Mabel officiated the ceremony, and children from the school sang hymns in 3 languages. The guest list included ranchers of every background who had learned that character mattered more than ancestry. As the sun set over their land, Evelyn and Thomas sat on their porch watching fireflies dance among the trees. "Ever regret falling asleep on that cowboy's shoulder?" Thomas asked. "Best decision I never made on purpose," she replied, settling against him just like that first stormy night. Their story became legend in the territory. The poor widow who inherited a fortune, and the enemy's son who chose love over loyalty. But they knew the real truth was simpler. Sometimes the most important journeys begin with a moment of vulnerable trust between strangers who don't yet know they're meant to build a life together.